Welcome to ePathshala lecture series in computer science, and this is a course in cloud computing. Today we will discuss about web services. So, the learning objectives of today's class will be like this. We will first discuss what is a service oriented architecture, and thereby we will see that what is the role of web service in that service oriented architecture and give an introduction to that. We will look at one specific web service, which is XML and web services based the technologies, and then we will see how service oriented architecture and cloud are closely related, followed by summary. In an earlier session, we talked about the new technology, when a new technology comes, what happens. So, let us just recapitulate that. We said that a new technology depends on a foundation technology, one or more foundation technologies, and for cloud our foundation technologies were distributed systems and parallel computing. Then we said that a new technology is also dependent on the enabling technologies, technologies that help them come across or come forward. In case of cloud, this is virtualization and service oriented architecture SOA. And finally, we have the dependent technologies, that there are other technologies which help this particular technology to grow. In case of cloud, that is P2P, peer to peer or P2P technology. So, we discussed distributed systems in details, and we discussed parallel computing as a little relevant mechanism. We discussed again in great details the virtualization mechanisms. Today, we are going to discuss about SOA or service oriented architecture. Now, this service oriented architecture, the service orientation is a way of thinking in terms of services and service based development. We also need to worry about what will be the outcome of a service. So, this SOA is the style of an architecture. So, it is called an architectural style that allows one to have a service oriented architecture or a service orientation. So, basically everything will be dependent on a service will be provided and a service will be accepted by the client. So, how does it look? The features of service oriented architecture will be the following. So, this framework will have several web services which will be all be required as part of the service orientation or service giving that service. These services, or as we call a web service, will be delivered using the SOA framework. So, there should be a set of standards that should be followed for delivering the service. Therefore, we call that web service is nothing but the implementation of a service oriented architecture. So, web service is one of the methods using which a service orientation can be realized or implemented. So, why we worry about SOA specifically? Because that is the logical method using which we can create a service oriented mechanism. So, these will be the services will be provided to the end users and even to other services. That perhaps is the most important part of having a web service via a publish, subscribe, discoverable interfaces. So, let us, before we get into the SOA, let us look at what is a service. What do we mean by when we say the term service? So, some activity which will be which can be repetitively done, sometimes or most of the times related to a certain business having a specific representation, so that we can identify that this is the service that has a specific outcome or a result, and that can be invoked by a user or whoever needs that service. We call, when all these characteristics are present in a software program, we call it a software service. So, typically an example may be a cash transaction in a web portal. It could be an online examination, it could be a blog or publishing examination results or election results. All these will be or are examples of how an automatic service can be used. So, a service can have a composition of multiple services. So, one service may not be necessarily one fundamental service, it can be composed of multiple services. So, if there are many more services, together we can create one service. This composition or all the complexity that are relevant to implementing such an environment should be completely transparent to the user. So, user should not be aware of the complexities behind the scene. Now, what are the different types of services? Any one of the three types of interactions that are possible. One is a man-to-man interaction. In a man-to-man interaction, we see that there is one human being who is the end user, and there is another human being who is the service provider, and there is an interaction between these two people. In a man-machine interaction, we see the user is still a human being, and there is a machine which can provide the service, and there is an interaction between these two. In the third type of interaction, which is a machine-machine interaction, in this we see that one machine requires something from another machine, and there is an interaction. So, if we look at the these three, we see that the last one, that is a machine-machine interaction, is what is specified to be a web service. So, if we quickly go through an example, we see that man to man will be a typical, we go to a vegetable shop or to a vendor and we buy something, that is my man to man interaction. A man machine is when we write an online test or pay money for buying something, that is a man machine, or take money, withdraw money from an ATM is a typical example of man machine interaction, and machine machine interaction are the web services that we are talking about, where one machine is the service provider, another machine is the service end user, and these two together without having a human interaction they can create the service. So, so let us look at now the web service per se. So, it is a software application that works by interacting with another application. One of these act as a provider and the other acts as a consumer or client, and this is a this has to be on a machine to machine interaction. So, at the conceptual level, we have this software component, we provide these through our network. So, in the network, the endpoint where the service is available should be accessible to the user who is residing on another part of the network or at the other end of this communication. Documents which are written in a language which is easily understandable can be exchanged, which will be machine, these exchanges will happen between the two machines as part of this service. At the technical level, when we look at this is the concept. Now, at the technical level, we see the difficulty of how do I implement such a concept on a machine to machine interaction. So, this is the so we have in a web service we have the application, various components of the application. Then these applications must interact with each other based on certain mechanisms, which must be some standard communication protocol, already established communication protocol. We then have the processes must be framed or must be encapsulated using some mechanism which is standard and which is understandable by both sides, and then these will be described. The messages must have again a predefined format using which these messages will be described, so that again there is no misunderstanding or no understanding it wrongly between these two processes. And it will provide the endpoint description, how to access, where to access, how these points are to be discovered. All these should be clearly mentioned, and it should be perhaps the most important part is it should be discoverable. So, when all these characteristics are there, we call a service a web service. So, in a web service, these are the various component characteristics that we saw. It should be XML based. Why XML based? Because XML is the de facto standard for expressing a message without getting into a misinterpretation. And these applications should be loosely coupled, because if we bind them very tightly, then the flexibility of the system is not there. So, the applications must be loosely coupled, and it should be coarse grained, so that very fine grained applications have the natural problem of being very related to each other. So, a coarse grained application is more suitable or characterizes web service. The exchange mechanism can either be, communication mechanism can either be synchronous or it can be asynchronous. Therefore, when we saw in distributed systems part, when we had the communication, that communication can either be synchronous or asynchronous. In a synchronous communication, I assume that the listening side or the server side is up and running and waiting, listening on a port on a specific endpoint to receive the message. In an asynchronous communication, the sender sends, but the receiver may not be in a position to receive right away, but at a later part the receiver will receive the message eventually. It could be RPC based. We learned RPC in detail, and the same mechanism can be used here, and it supports document exchange. What is a document? What is the importance of document exchange? Then if it only supports a specific kind of message, then the description of whatever is not, there is not much scope of describing. Since our web services, this service oriented architecture, specifically one kind is where I have the opportunity to use a specific description, it helps to describe the complexities or the requirements of the service, and therefore have a very clear cut clean service mechanism. So, to look at the web service integration, let us think that there is a user who is using a specific browser, and through the internet the user is able to contact the web server. This web server contains whatever application the user wants, and through the internet it can contact the web server. But the problem of this mechanism is that if the web server is down, if a different version of the application has come, for all such things we need to take out the web server, redo the work in the web server and put it back. This inconveniences the user. So, to avoid that, the next thing that came is attach a database. Now, take away the data from the web server to the database and let the web server know the address of the database. Now, if there is a change of a version or some new data comes, we do not need to take away the web server as such. The browser still continues accessing the web server, but the web server now accesses a different database. So, this works gives a certain kind of flexibility to our web server based scenario. Even that is not sufficient. When that is not sufficient, we take away the whole application from the web server. So, web server remains as a simple front end which gets accessed by the client, and everything, the application and the data go to the back end, and these are managed and accessed by the web server. So, now if the application changes, if the data changes, if the application server fails, there is no problem, because this will be handled by the web server. Then all these connections can be done using a JDBC connection. Then the legacy applications now can reside somewhere in some servers and can be accessed by the application server totally transparently to the end user who is sitting at the browser level. Then came the question of safety. Then we put a firewall around the web server, saying that do not access the web server, only access through the firewall. So, this forms a very secured environment where through a browser one service can be accessed with complete flexibility. When we replace this browser with a similar kind of another machine, and we allow this machine also to ask for a service to this machine, and this machine can ask for a service to this machine, we call it a web service application integration. So, web services are self-describing. They have the mechanism of having the descriptions of their own. They are a self-contained software module. They have everything within that and no need for an outside intervention. Through the internet, they can be accessed via networking, via internet, which is standard networking. It can complete its task. So, however many servers need to be included or need to be orchestrated, the whole task can be completed by the web services without any manual intervention. It solves large problems, very large problems also can be resolved using web services, and it can conduct transactions. So, monetary transaction, I take some money from a bank and pay for certain service, all these things can be done using through web services. And the architecture that it uses is a distributed architecture, of course, that goes without saying, and therefore, the applications that interact with each other are they reside in geographically different locations, and even a private networking can be used for implementing a web service. So, let us look at an example web service. This can take many forms. When we talk about a self-contained business task, typically what comes to the mind is the fund withdrawal or some deposit of money. Full-fledged business process, an example will be some office supplies that can be purchased, or a travel arrangement that can be made using a web service. An application is can be anything like a life insurance, or some forecasting or something like that, that is an application. and a service enabled resource would be to specific backend data when I want to access some resource through some service. It is a service enabled resource that may contain some students record, that may contain some medical record, or that may contain any pertinent information that we need to access. So, it can vary in the form of the function. It can be a simple request without any further additions. I can simply ask for a certain information. So, it will be given to me, credit checking, how much money can I withdraw, or pricing enquiries. All these are simple business, or it can be a very complex business model with many components put together. So, typically a brokering system, and insurance liability, a travel plan, all these come under the complex systems. So, what are the goals of web services? To enable distributed applications that can be dynamically assembled to the changing business needs, as per the changing business needs, to allow customization based on the devices, whatever will be the requirement accordingly. If I want to use mobile phone, or if I want to use a workstation, based on that it can accommodate itself, and to allow users to access a wide range of services using different business logic. So, to talk about different types of web services, we have typically largely used web service is it's called a big web service, or it is the SOAP based web service, and the other is resource oriented web service, that is called the RESTful web service. The data formats typically used are XML and JSON, and there are other data formats also that can be used. So, for XML, the full form of XML is extensible markup language, that is called XML. It is a markup language. It is a typically fixed formatted language that can be used to describe whatever data we have in hand, and there are various tags that are provided. These tags, the beauty of XML is that the tags are not predefined. So, the flexibility inside the inflexible structure can be implemented using XML, and hence it is the perfect choice for enabling a web service. Therefore, XML is extensively used in, particularly in SOAP based web services. JSON, on the other hand, it stands for JavaScript object notation. It again is used for storing and exchanging data. It is a data format, of course, but this is much lightweight data exchange format. It is more of description of the scenario in a more natural language like mechanism. Therefore, its language is easy to understand, and largely syntaxes are not followed. Therefore, it makes, for humans it is much easier to use XML. It uses JavaScript syntax. So, now we discuss the web services technology. This is the big web services technology, or SOAP based web services technology. So, in this is a service oriented architecture. So, here we have a mechanism. This is a typically publish subscribe kind of an environment, where we have a registry with which all information are stored, and whichever service user or requester wants to access a specific service has to contact the registry for using the service. The service provider will first publish the service to the registry, and the user will use the find the service from a registry and then we will bind with the service provider. So, therefore, this is the typical architecture that we follow in a SOAP based service oriented architecture. So, we give an example of SOAP based web service. Here is the buyer or the client and here is the UDDI registry. We also have the server which is providing the service. When the client is looking for a specific buying option, it posts that request in the browser and that is sent to the UDDI registry. The UDDI registry contains or has the information about a WSDL document which describes what the server can provide and that is referred to the client. The client in turn will ask the WSDL document to provide the necessary information about the server and will receive the necessary information. With this information, the user contacts the service and obtains the service. So, this is a typical easy way of for a client to contact a server without knowing anything about the kind of service. Therefore, this environment provides an easy way of discovering a service and accessing a service. So, we come to the conclusion of this particular module. In summary, we look at the overall module. We have defined and understood what is a service oriented architecture and then we looked at the role of web services and we looked at the technologies of basic architecture and technologies of the SOAP based web services and we looked at the example. In the next class, we will continue completing the understanding of these SOAP based web services and we will go into the RESTful web services. These are our references. Thank you.